All right, welcome everybody. It is my absolute privilege to have returning guest JP Marceau back on the podcast. We are going to get into a fantastic conversation about a few of my favorite things, like his article on our contraceptive culture and NFP, but then somehow we're going to tie it together with aliens. So that's what's before us. JP, how are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. It's been a few that we've had, and they've always been fun. Plus, we regularly speak off camera. So, yeah, I trust this will be fun.
Yeah, so it started out, let's see, you brought me on to your YouTube channel, which is fantastic, by the way. And
Thanks.
You asked the question, are stories real?
Yep.
And we talked about one of my Symbolic World article blogs posts. And then later on, you wrote about miracles, the topic, but most specifically the book title by C.S. Lewis. Mm-hmm. And so I asked you, are miracles real? So I bring you back, and I don't really have a good question to follow that segment. So maybe are contraceptives real? Probably not. But yeah, so let's see, where do we kick off? Earlier in the year, Jonathan Peugeot and I had a really awesome talk. And one of the hot topics of our discussion was centered around sexuality. And one of the things that he talked about was how it's not just like contraceptives, like the things themselves, but it's actually that we see the patterns of contraception throughout our entire society. And he went on and did a phenomenal job bringing up amazing points that I didn't even think about before. And you were active in the comment section, so I know that you read it, but then you also cited it in your recent article, the symbolism of contraceptions and NFP. So maybe what were some things that cued you in that conversation with Jonathan?
Yeah, well, you made a really good point about contraception being a separator from participation, so that in the sexual act itself, a contraceptive will cut off participation. But the same thing happens at other scales of our society, that in general, our society will seek pleasure without full participation. So, I mean, I was thinking about this, even today, it popped into my mind. I saw something about the TV show Friends, and it reminded me that I thought it was weird that some shows like this didn't have any sort of obvious point or even narrative. A lot of it was about, it was kind of people living a normal kind of life, maybe like slightly better, but like it's sort of a comfortable life that people could sort of get in without having to live such a life themselves. And I can sort of reminisce about How I Met Your Mother is a bit of the same. And in general, I think there's this phenomenon where we can, let's say, watch Netflix and live sort of live contraceptives kind of lives through like movies rather than going out and actually living this. And I mean, it happens at different layers. So I think that this basic insight, I make use of this basic insight, let's say in the article, but like the biggest line of thought that I use in the article, I think is, so Jonathan's idea that there are different layers of being. And I mean, you can find this throughout Christian tradition, but like I think that with Jonathan's framework, he can often lay it out in a very simple way. And so I try to use this framework to speak about things that I found also within my tradition, so in the Catholic tradition, what we say about contraceptives, because I got married just a few months ago, and like this was preceded by months of study and discussion.
Yeah, about congratulations, man.
Thanks. So I mean, it was preceded by months and really like a year or two of study and discussion around those kinds of topics. We talk about a bunch of other things, but like these topics, especially about contraception, about what is and isn't permitted, about why, like what are all of the justifications for all of this. Those are not obvious topics to speak about in our society, and I've often made use of symbolism to think about them. So I mean, throughout all of this, like when I wrote this article, I already had everything fairly clear in my mind. It's just that I wanted to write it. So I go through it at several layers, and it's really when I get to the social layer that I made use of Jonathan's insight. But like afterwards, you can see it nested in the other layers as well. Because in general, like the pattern of contraception is, let's say, separating a fact from a purpose, or separating pleasure from responsibility. Like it's going to be about separating something, like contracepting a pattern. And we'll see it at different layers of our society. And so right away in contraception, you can see it at the, like not only at the biological level where it stops like one process, but it's fairly easy, I think, to see that it stops processes going on at the psychological level as well. So, I mean, if you take something that is, let's say, permitted in most traditional churches, let's say if you take NFP, like in those circumstances, it's possible to abstain from relationships if you don't think you're ready to have a child, but you cannot stop the full relation from happening. You cannot use contraceptives, or like you cannot pull out. Like there are a bunch of things you can do. Basically, you have to go for a full relationship or you abstain. Those are just the options.
It might be good that I give a slight disclaimer that this conversation is probably going to be PG-13.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, okay, so why don't you hold that thought, because I want you to maybe define some of these terms. So like, maybe let's start with NFP. What does that stand for?
Yeah, it stands for natural family planning. So, and it's good to keep it in mind when we think about contraception, because like they really stand in contrast to one another. So the idea in natural family planning is you cannot go against the purposes of sexuality. So there are many purposes to sexuality. The two main ones are procreation and union. So you can bring about life, that's fairly obvious, but it also unites the spouses. And now if you look at the procreative function, like it will vary throughout the month. Like the wife isn't fertile at every moment in the month. So this function can vary throughout the month, but you can never go against one of those purposes. So if let's say you with NFP, what you'll do typically is you'll track some biological measures. So the wife will measure a few things, and it's possible to know with a fairly good degree of accuracy, like when the wife is pregnant or not, with like a few days of interval. So you can let's say play it less safe or play it more safe, but it's possible if you do it safely enough to be about as effective as planning births as if you were using modern contraceptives.
So JP, I just got to come out and say that my wife and I have been practicing NFP practices for like our whole marriage for about 6 years. And up until this point, I thought we were the only nerdy ones that were like brave enough to try it. So already this conversation is like piquing my joy. So okay, so yeah, like from what I know about it, we've incorporated technology. We have this like little thermometer computer where like it's like maybe I should have brought it in, but it has like this thermometer that's kind of like a hook, and you're like, what am I taking my temperature at? The woman would ask, and it's like, oh no, it's an oral thermometer. And what's really without getting into the details or the weeds, all of the different tactics and technology and practices really opened us up to understanding my wife's like anatomy, the cycles. It connected me with, you could say, symbolism of like, gee, it's pretty phenomenal that my wife's cycle lines up almost exactly with the moon. Yeah. And so then it's like, oh, we're not just like la-di-da making this stuff. The ancients have not just like conceived of this idea like just because they thought it was fun. Like they see how the patterns of the biological feminine body correlates to other things in nature, but then also in the heavens.
Yeah, like the fact that the moon can receive the sun like one day or a few days a month.
Yes, and so so like with the thermometer thing, right? You monitor it, and all of a sudden there's this like spike, right? And you're like, oh my goodness, what's happening? But then it dips, and then like like the woman's body temperature will actually dip, and it's like, oh, there's changes happening, and it's just like completely, it added a level of knowledge that then responded in deeper intimacy with my wife.
Yeah.
And I'm not just talking about sexual intimacy. I mean, like, I felt like I knew her more because I was part of this process. I don't know if you guys have experienced that yet.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I get into it at the narrative level in the article, because like what this will do, the fact that, I mean, if you're using contraceptive, you can just like do whatever you want all the time. So there isn't much of a narrative there. It's sort of flat. But if you use if you use NFP, what you have to do is you have to know like where you're at, like not only in the month, but also it makes you consider your narrative as a couple, because some parts of the months are more risky than others for the possibility of having children. So let's say you have to know whether or not you're willing to accept this possibility at this part of the month. So like it's all, so this long-term narrative of, are we ready to have more children? Am I ready to take care of my wife and child if my wife gets pregnant? Conversely, like the wife can ask, well, do I trust my husband enough to have sex with him at this moment? Like the immediate moment of intimacy that happens at a given instant is intrinsically linked to a story that will take like years to unfold in the future. So so it means that when you have sexual relations in that context, it's not just about the moment of sexual intimacy at that time. It's about a narrative. It's about jumping into a higher level of reality where you think about the narrative. And one interesting fact that I note in the article, and sadly there isn't that much good data on this, but it looks like, I think it makes perfect sense, that couples who practice NFP have a lower divorce rate. And that's even if you consider, let's say, serious Catholic couples. It's where I heard about this study initially, because it's fairly common, at least like you mentioned earlier that you thought you were like the only couple willing to try it. In Catholic couples, it's more open. We talk about it like in Catholic, at least in serious couples, like that's just the way to go. If you look online, you'll find that
Are you saying it's more of like part of the Catholic culture?
Yeah.
Okay, so in like Protestant culture, it's contraceptives of all sorts have been normalized by and large. So like it definitely felt like we were the odd ones out, and I've only talked to a few other people about this. So
yeah.
So now I just wanted to say also about the narrative. It's interesting because like Neil deGrasse talked about how like his theory on why there's a perception that time is speeding up, and it's just like because he in his musical terms would say like a climax of events. Like my example would be when I was young, my mom and dad, they bought me a pocket knife before we went camping. And they said, we're going to give this to you, when we go camping. And so for a whole month, it was just like this anticipation was building. And so once that moment happened, I just like, gleefully screamed, "Yeah, I got my pocket knife." And so I feel like that is a beat is what he calls it. And so if you have like just so many of those moments back to back to back to back to back, then it kind of flatlines.
Yeah.
Right. And then, or the other moment is like, oh, well, we don't just have certain days that are holy. We have, all days are holy. Every day is holy. Well, if every day is holy, then none are, is some of the pushback that I've heard. And so I feel like these climax of the given segment of time, whether it's a week or in this case, a moon cycle or a month, it is like it for my wife and I, it produces this narrative of anticipation, of risk, of tension, of exuberance, of elation. And it seems to all of those things come together for, I guess, a greater climax, you could say.
Yeah. It creates a narrative for the couple, and it's what makes the couple stronger also over time. You talk about a bunch of stuff that other couples wouldn't speak about if they're using contraceptives. So So that's sort of what happens at the narrative layer. And I mean, it gives, you can also think about the narrative importance it has to make people leave their basement. So for,
Oh, yes, right.
because I think that's an important aspect that sort of flies under the radar. But I think one of the big reasons why a lot of men are sort of discouraged and spend a lot of time in their basement is because of this contraceptive culture, where, let's say, because of contraceptives, women don't have to be that demanding of men. Let's say they can just have sex with a guy that they find attractive for the moment without having to think about whether or not this guy is qualified to have a family in the future. So women are willing to give themselves much easier because of contraceptives. And it also means that men don't have to become men with a powerful narrative. If they can become like, if they're able to seduce women in the short term, that may well be good enough. And for those who can't, I mean, even worse than that is like, a bunch of men can also just like stay in their basements, watch porn and Netflix, and have a contracepted life where they sort of experience some of the pleasures of life without actually participating in life fully. And like all of those things are bunched up together. Like if let's say in more traditional societies where contraception was out of the question, then the only way for a man to have relations with a woman was to become a man worth marrying. So you had to step up your game. You had to embark on a real narrative, and then you could find a wife. And then I mean, even there, you had to like keep up the narrative. Otherwise, you would sort of have a miserable marriage, or you would be alone. And so, like, even this very, let's say, basic sexual instinct that men had can be raised up into the level of narrative if you have something like NFP rather than contraception.
Mhm. Yeah, I like how you're talking about how contraception is like this separator. I know that like Jonathan Peugeot talks about the garments of death or the garments of
Yep.
skin that Adam and Eve used to protect them from death. So you're like using death to protect you or separate you from death. But then, of course, you could look at mini contraception as that. You're like, what, using technology, or you're using foreign things in order to protect you from the results or the responsibility of the sexual act. And it allows you to separate something that is meant to be in union, like the ecstasy or the pleasure part of it, from the responsibility.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking, like, it's just interesting how, like, you write this article and, oh, he must be talking about condoms. But you start talking about, like, say, a gamer in the basement type of thing, and you're realizing, like, oh, they're using technology of entertainment in order to separate them from the potential of being a man worth marrying. And so they're able to retain some of that pleasure, but try to separate the responsibility. So, like, what are some of the results of people as they try to do that?
Yeah, well, I do think that, let's see, if you look at it at the social scale, let's say, I think you see the results you see is the meaning crisis, where in general we tend to divorce, like we will negate purpose in general. So if you're willing to negate, let's say, the reproductive purpose of sexuality, then it's going to be easy to negate purpose in general. So, and it's not like, as I said earlier, it's not that the only purpose of sexuality is procreation. It's also uniting the spouses. But like, if you negate the very obvious purpose of procreation, then it's going to be easy to negate all kinds of other purposes that you have in front of you. So, and it's, I mean, our age does negate purpose in general. A lot of us, like, not only people are often nihilistic in their outlook on life, but also people can be just relativistic, where they don't really think that there's anything, let's say, beyond the subjective of, okay, well, people can have their different pleasures and their desires, and that's it. And even in our metaphysics, like, it's very common for people to deny teleology, to deny the fact that there are ends to things. And like this, let's say, theoretical denial of teleology is tied up with, let's say, the fact that our passions are also unchained and not directed towards a purpose. Like those two things feed one another. If you don't believe in teleology, it's easy to sort of justify your urges. And conversely, like if you don't have practice in orienting yourself towards a telos, then it's going to be easy to deny teleology in general. So this happens. We can also see it in the fact that we don't want to participate in the creation of life in general. So it's going to be true in couples. Let's say if a couple wants to use contraception to avoid having children, then you also see at the social scale that a lot of Western societies don't even have enough children to sustain themselves.
Right. The birth rate is a growing concern in developed societies.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it's totally linked. I mean, let's say if you were too afraid of the responsibilities of life to have children, then you're gonna like slowly have a more negative outlook on life in general. You're gonna think more about, let's say, yourself, your comfort, and less about life and the worth of life in itself. So if say I asked something else, but I dropped it. Let me see if there's something else we can say about the social layer.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that you jumped if this, then that. Like, so what I could use some clarity on when reading your article is, so at the social layer, it was like, if then we have a, contraceptive induced unconsciousness, quote unquote.
Yep.
Then, and we don't have, we're disconnected from purpose, then that means that it's like a snowball effect, and then suddenly nothing else is meaningful. Especially when you take the topic of something that is probably the most meaningful thing that like a human can embark on, or the most powerful creative act that we can engage with.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a deep thing. If another way to put it is in terms of like the intensity of the pleasure of the experience, like the fact that sexual union is so pleasurable is supposed to be tied up to the fact that it's extremely high in responsibility. Like the pleasure and the responsibility are tied together. You can also say that the fact is tied with a purpose. And if we start negating it for something that is as high in the hierarchy as sexuality, then like things lower are going to start to crumble as well. And it's not like there's it's interesting I'm not sure how to qualify the causality there exactly. I don't know if it would be a kind of emanation, or if you don't uphold the pattern in the place where it's supposed to be very intense and where it's supposed to, let's say, we can think about it we can think of the layers we mentioned earlier. Let's say if you don't have the psychological and narrative layers of sexuality to sort of make you rise up, if you start losing that, then I mean, you're just cutting yourself off from layers of being that you could access more often. You're gonna naturally like stay lower. You're gonna be closer to your immediate pleasures, and it's gonna lead to those other kinds of problems where you seek pleasure without full-blown participation. Maybe let's say, and if it's not obvious to people, it's worth considering just how direct the experience can be. Like I recall watching when my fiance at the time and I were like preparing and like studying all of this, and we watched a video about NFP with a guy who mentioned that like it was terrifying to him, and the fact that I mean, because some people can ask, well, if
it is a bit terrifying.
Yeah.
Well, especially when you are encultured in a contraceptive society, and all of the people you look up around, at least in my world, it's a totally normal thing. And it's like there's this fear of conception.
Yeah.
And so then you like say, like, because we looked into it, and there's risk with every single form of conception, every single one. And some of them are almost unspeakable. Like it's hard, it's really hard to talk about, say, the pill. A lot of people don't know this, but the pill will abort conceived, or how do you say it, fertilized eggs. So a lot of Christian people, you know, who maybe they're very pro-choice and they have a fight against abortion and they want people to choose life, you know, they're potentially eliminating fertilized eggs without maybe consciously knowing about it.
Yeah.
So like, as we were looking into it, we're like, okay, so not that, definitely want to do that. It really, a lot of the contraceptions, they obliterate and just scramble up the biology and the hormonal balance of women. Like I remember having a friend where like her bones weren't healing. She broke her arm and her arm would not heal because of the type, I think it was the Depo or Depot shot. It was like intense form of birth control. And anyway, so it was like, you just go down the list and it's like, none of them are 100% and all of them are potentially harmful for both parties. And so we're like, wow, like what other options do we have? And so that's when we found out like, oh, you know, you can actually just learn how to measure different parts of the body and it's totally a thing. And then we had one person at church and she has like a wonderful family. She's like, oh yeah, I never did that stuff. And it was like, oh, this like angel that like gave us the little bit of reassurance that we needed to move on. But then I remember feeling like, at least the first couple of months, like terrified and like, okay, you know, speaking of Friends, did you watch the clip where Ross freaks out whenever he learns that condoms aren't 100% effective? And then I think it's Rachel
I actually barely watched. I think I watched like 2 episodes maybe, but no, I didn't watch that clip.
Yeah, so look it up, man. It's like classic. It's like, so he is so confused and he's like, he just feels like he was ripped off. Like how did we end up conceiving a child? We used a condom. Like black and white here, like you use a condom, you don't have a baby. And then the rest of the friends informed him that, hey, read the box, you know, like it's only, you know, whatever, 90 something percent effective. And of course he just like has a total crisis and he freaks out and he's like wailing into a pillow and a couch and running around the room. It's like totally over dramatized, but like I feel like it's so indicative of our entire society, right? Where it's like they were told, they have a frame of mind about this, and suddenly like I had a similar type of experience where it's like, oh no, it's not 100% and it's harmful.
Yeah. And like, even if you know, then okay, well, it's not 100%, but like if the odds of, let's say, the odds of avoiding conception are fairly high when you do NFP, even if you know that, okay, well, it's about as high as other contraceptives and people aren't freaked out about them in general. Once you, like, as you say, just like as soon as you know the stats, that it's a bit like scary in itself. Like, you know that there's responsibility like every time, like even if you weren't using another contraceptive, but like just biologically, like the fact that you don't yourself put a barrier makes it more involved, like scarier, just because you know that you're not yourself being opposed to that teleology. So immediately your biology knows this, that okay, well, this is a serious act, and it automatically makes the act much more meaningful. Like when you're not putting up that barrier and your wife isn't putting up that barrier, then you're both telling each other something very deep. You're telling like, okay, well, I trust you enough to have a child with you, that I'll be able to take care of you. I trust you enough to do the same. So immediately you have a level of meaning that isn't available with contraceptives. And it's just the first layer. That's just like an immediate psychological layer. We also talked about,
and it's often implicit too. Like you don't even have to have a conversation about it.
Yeah. And yeah, so it's just at the immediate biological, psychological level that's just implicit. You don't even need to speak about it, but above it, you can mention the narrative pattern that we also talked about, the fact that, well, you'll have to discuss your narrative as a family, because now, I mean, you have to take it into account, like throughout the month. You have to.
Well, okay,
like,
so this is how this is one of the ways we take it into account. So like,
yeah.
say we're getting to that critical point, the
Mhm.
climax of the month, let's say, where it is quite likely that if we were to move forward, we would conceive a child. There's times where, the other fascinating thing is like physiochemically, the wife is actually like telling you through different hormones in her body, like, hey, I'm really attractive. And she like it's almost like how certain lizards will like I remember an iguana down in Costa Rica. It's a normal green iguana, but when it comes to that time, it becomes this like radiant orange color. So like humans do that, come to find out. And like there's this certain attraction that's happening at a very like biological or anatomical level. So there's times where it's like I'm sensitive to these things now, where before, or alternatively, I'm not sure if other people even notice that. You say if they're on the pill, then it's just like,
Yeah.
But it adds like I said, this interesting tension. So one of the things that I joke about, I'm like, well, I guess I'll just have to schedule to go up to the mountain and visit with the monks for a few days. She's like, no, dude, don't do that. I want you so close. And I'm like, no, that's the problem.
Yeah. So, I mean, let's say, to come back to the question you asked earlier about,
sure, yeah, go ahead.
Like, how do we, like, how does this seep into the social layer? Well, I think it's sort of progressive, where like if you practice NFP rather than contraception, then you're able to ascend like those layers, and then you'll get this impact at the psychological level that is stronger. You'll be in an actual narrative, and this will also have social repercussions, where like in the way that your narrative intermeshes with other people's narrative, you won't be reinforcing contraceptive patterns yourself. You're more likely to like go out and participate in life rather than staying inside. You're more likely to have a family with many children. You're like, so this will seep into the social culture as well, where you'll have a different kind of life from people who are, let's say, living life through their screens, like through garments of skins that like prevent them from interacting with the outside. And like I think it's just a good image of a culture, and Jonathan laid it out well, I think, in that that segment of your conversation. And once you spot it, you can see it like in many places of our culture, where we're really happy to cut ourselves off and just seek immediate pleasures. But ultimately, maybe contraception is a great image of it, particularly because it's such a clear separation from, let's say, pleasure and life, where you try to, let's say, you try to have just the pleasure without participating in the creation of life. So like
I love that part of your article, by the way.
It's maybe the clearest way of putting it. Yeah.
Well, yeah, because then you take it to the cosmic level, or the creative level. Where before, like, I'm just looking at this quote, I love it. We want sterile entertainment disconnected from real life commitment. But then you take it to the cosmic level, where it's incorporated into a spiritual practice, and you bring up this ladder, the spiritual ladder of ascension, where you can actually like improve your whole being, right, through the practice of this union. And then you make a point, like I just got to read it off. You say, yeah, but a ladder up the layers of being. They remind the couple that the ultimate purpose of sexuality is not pleasure, nor union, nor even procreation. And so at this time, I'm like, but you just spent the whole article talking about that stuff. So where are you going? And then you say, but active participation in God's creation and redemption of the world. And so that's where you like take this thing to the next level.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I tried to go, I mean, earlier in the article, I make my way from, say, what happens at the biological level, then psychological level, narrative level, social level. But ultimately, like we were just speaking about the fact that contraception stops you from participating in the creation of life. And this means that if you practice NFP, if you're willing to have children, if you're not cutting off that participation, then you're participating in the creation of life. You're participating, therefore, in God's creation of life. And I also mentioned that you're also participating in God's redemption of the world, because as parents, you're sacrificing yourself for one another and for your children. And like, this is really tied up with creation. I think you can even tie it up with, let's say, the lamb slain from the foundation of the world. Let's say when the Father and the Son create the world in the Spirit, they know that creation is going to go astray and that the lamb will need to be sacrificed to bring it back up in proper harmony. So I think the sexual union can really be seen this way, as a participation of life that will also require a sacrifice by the parents to, let's say, save that life that is invariably going to get into trouble. So when you go against contraception and you use something like NFP, then you're affirming life, and it's worth to the extent that you're willing to sacrifice yourself for it. So it's like in total opposition from what we said earlier about the meaning crisis and denialism that is going on at the moment in our culture. And it's worth bringing it up also, the fact that, well, I mean, if you can, it's possible if you do NFP, you can just have 18 children. But if you don't think you're able to do that, then you're going to need periods of asceticism. You're going to need to abstain like often. And this is also like super valuable, spiritually speaking, because you're reminding yourself, you're teaching yourself to see purposes that are above the merely biological level. You can see that, okay, well, I can't just have my pleasure and cut off all of those other layers of being. If I can't, it also focuses you on, let's say, the purpose. Like, why do you care about all of those layers of being? Like, why does it matter? It makes you think about teleology itself. It makes you think about what all of those things are for, which is ultimately God. So it means that like these periods of asceticism and prayer and contemplation and reflection can then feed back. Once you no longer abstain, you've gone through this experience of thinking more about the higher layers, so that sexual union after abstinence becomes higher. Like, it's not just that the pleasure will be higher at the physical level, but also that the higher layers will be more obvious to you. Let's say you'll be better able to participate in the higher levels during the participation itself because of the times of asceticism. And those obviously don't exist if you use contraception.
Yeah, I'd say that both they complement each other to allow you to go deeper or higher. So it makes it exciting. It's like, when I was younger, I got really excited about Batman and the DC universe and like dressing up and being a part of like when the Dark Knight was coming out and going to the theater super early, and like it feels like the energy that's in that and the thrill and like genuine joy that comes from that, it's like I can actually, that's my life now because of Christianity and the Christian story. I don't know if you feel that too, but particularly,
it's a great way of putting it.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the closest thing that I can compare to that excitement level but now I get to actually like carry it out. It's not some liminal thing that I, don't really, it's almost like a contraceptive thrill, because like I don't get to engage with it. I just get to receive it from a distance. So
what do you mean now? What are you not participating in there?
Well, I'm not in the Batman movie, right? So like I'm engaging in a liminal place, a place in between, maybe like the narrative and the life we live. So I think the cool thing about these topics is it's not just some like cool, maybe thought hobby or fictional story. It's actually like it gets incorporated into the life that I live and the relationships that I hold and the things that I do. So I guess it's like narratively, it's like a first person role-playing game, right? Where like you actually get to be part of it. which really helps with that teleology too, because now it's like, it's not just my purpose, but it's like the collective purpose of the ontological unit that is my family. But
Yeah.
then it's also like our whole family is part of the bigger, ontological unit of humanity.
Mhm.
Gosh, we're really inching closer to arrival, but not quite in the alien topic. But there's a few other things I wanted to bring up.
Yeah.
So so they complement each other. So for example, when there's those seasons of my wife's moon cycle where it's like
Mhm.
we don't engage in that physical intimacy that would bring about
Mhm.
children, it's like it doesn't take away that desire to be intimate, if only, and it doesn't agitate it once you learn how to direct it in the right
Mhm.
place. So for example, there is for example, we end up doing things together
Mhm.
that we would not do normally. For example, the second time that I listened to you reading your essay,
Mhm.
we listened to it together.
Mhm.
And so it was and then all of a sudden we're engaging in this like uh, inter-family dialogue about this topic. And then so now like I feel her support because it's something that I'm very interested in.
Mhm.
And it's something that, and then she feels supported because like, oh, something that he really cares about is in fact a thing that supports and builds up the whole family.
Mhm.
So you see, like it's very
Yeah.
intimate, even though like, or it doesn't even have to be like, it's like even the times where we're apart, it still allows us to engage in maybe forgotten areas if we
Mhm.
were to just be able to
Yeah.
be physically intimate all the time.
Yeah. It like gives you time to do things that you probably should do, but you may not do right away if you didn't have, let's say, the time to do them. Like if you didn't have a good reason to do those things.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
like I mean, you could watch TV, right? And then if you were to stop watching TV, you'd say like, well, I still have this drive to,
Yeah.
be engaged creatively and imaginatively. Then maybe I'll write essays. Maybe I'll write books. Maybe
Mhm.
I'll make YouTube videos instead.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. It brings up a good image because, like, if you were to just watch a movie with your wife, it probably wouldn't do the trick. Like, if there isn't enough participation in there. Like, because I mean, if you let's say, as we said earlier, sexuality can make you participate in very high levels of being. So if you try to substitute that by doing something very mundane, then it just won't work. Like, it won't quell the
Or
urge.
passive.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Then you need to do something that is also fairly high in the hierarchy. So St. Paul, for instance, when he writes that don't abstain from one another unless it's for a season to dedicate yourselves more to prayer and fasting, like this kind of stuff.
Yes.
So I mean, so it's fine to deny yourself, let's say, sexually, if you have something else that happens at the high layer that will also like allow for a high degree of participation in God ultimately. So I mean, if you use that time to discuss spiritual topics, if you use that time to pray together, to like do more stuff with your community, then you're finding another way to participate in higher levels of being, and it's good for you. So it's
Oh
a
my gosh, like praying with my wife was hard at first.
Mhm.
It surprised me. Whereas like, I mean, like, it's very typical that couples learn and get better at
Mhm.
physical intimacy.
Mhm.
But it really surprised because like we're both Christians when we at the time of getting married. And so I was like, oh, that'll be like the easiest thing. But like it wasn't.
Mhm.
It was awkward, it was frustrating, it was kind of shallow. So like we had to learn how to pray together.
Yeah.
And I think it's just amazing how more deeply we bonded over the
Mhm.
years because of these periods where we're not physically intimate,
Mhm.
that it actually did things that I'm not sure. I don't think we'd be able to have such a connected spiritual
Mhm.
relationship than if we didn't have these periods of abstinence.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
our prayer life is awesome right now. It's like uh, again, it kind of gets back to that thing where like you'd think, oh, that's like the practical part. No, it's like it's actually the pleasurable part. I mean, it's sacrificial, instead of doing what you want to do or watching that, Netflix episode, you actually do some form of work, you could say. But then in that practice of doing it and the discipline of doing it together, it bonds you together. It makes the individuals and it makes the parts better. So then the whole matrimonial union is now more pleasurable. It's almost like the two parts, right? Where you have let's say the practical elements of work and maintaining the household, and then you have the ecstatic or the pleasurable. And it's like, the further we go along in marriage, it's like those two things become closer and closer to being one. It's almost like at the same rate that she and I are getting closer together and becoming one. I don't know. I know you're how'd you say, you're fresh into your marriage, but have you begun experiencing these things too?
Yeah, I think so. And yeah, to some extent, we'll see like how things go in the future. It's going to be really interesting and engaging. At the moment, I think, let's say when we already see some changes, like from how we were, because we've been speaking about these things for a while, and things become, let's say, much clearer through time. So there's a bunch of stuff that not only, let's say, we didn't have the right, let's say, immediate moral intuitions about the fact that certain things are good or certain things are bad. So for instance, initially we couldn't like see why NFP was better than contraception in any way. Like we didn't perceive it. And even in asking questions, like we had enough, let's say, arguments and counter arguments about this and that even at the intellectual level, things didn't make a lot of sense. So we had to work through it at the intellectual level. And then progressively, it made its way to our immediate perception, where there are things that we see as good or bad, like that is just immediate now. Whereas initially, we couldn't even like justify why intellectually things were good or bad. Not only couldn't we perceive them, but we couldn't even like intellect them. So like I've seen some of these things change. And also I found that like the periods of abstinence themselves have become, because I think it's become probably easier with time, because even like we had to abstain before marriage, obviously, and then like sporadically throughout the marriage since we got married. And I think that because of like just this practice of trying to see the higher level patterns, it's become easier to the point where like initially I recall, let's say when reading about white marriages or like saints who are married but then eventually separate to join monasteries, like when hearing those stories, it just sounded kind of insane and weird to me. But I think I see better now. It's kind of obvious that it would be a good thing if it could be managed, where you have a couple that eventually, because they've bonded so much in prayer and they've practiced enough ascending those layers of being, at some point their prayer is even more powerful and even more pleasurable than sexual union itself. So they just want to stay there. And like, it seems to me like it's not like I can taste that, but like, it seems to me that, and I trust the tradition. So it seems to me that obviously if you can make your way there, it's better. Like if you can like reach this state of being, it's what you should aim for. Whereas it wasn't even really plausible. It wasn't that plausible to me. Like I could trust the tradition enough to know that, well, maybe, but like it wasn't clear enough in my mind. It wasn't, let's say, intellectually justifiable enough, and it wasn't perceptually clear enough that it was like a good aim, something good to aim for. But at this point, I think it's something that we would both be happy with, like that if we were like if you could make it. Like obviously it's tough to achieve, but like I think it's an example to answer a question of where I see things shifting through time, where our like these practices that we do as a married couple, doing NFP and like engaging in spiritual practices, all those things is shaping us in a way that we can see is transforming our perception of things.
Yeah. And I think kind of getting back to this cosmic level, or this like sexuality is like a cosmogenic act where you're actually like procreating. So just maybe like to kind of dive into the etymology. So like So procreation, it's like we actually like get to be active participants in the power and the mystery of creation. But then like some of these other words too, like you think of conception, right? Where like let's see, what ception is the like it means to take, to grab a hold of. And then you have contraception, which is like against that. And I just find it interesting because if you look at how we use the word conception or conceive, it's not just like we conceive children, we can actually conceive ideas, right? Like we use that term and that how would you say, we apply that meaning to the realm of ideas as well. So I think that like it's just interesting how you couldn't conceive of that idea until you engaged with the practice of it.
That's a good point.
So like with conception, it's almost like the seed being sown, right? So you have the seed in the soil, and if you don't actually sow the seed into the soil, it doesn't have the potential to grow into a tree. And I feel like this is a really interesting idea, because if we don't sow our seed in a proper way, then we can create, how would you say it, monsters.
You leave room. Let's say if you don't, let's say you have a bunch of potential, and if you're not sowing good seeds in it, then you're leaving things blank at the lowest level for something else to pop up. So if you just stay in your basement and like don't engage in higher level patterns, then some higher level pattern is just going to grab you.
Exactly. Yeah. So it could be one that tears you apart, or that holds you in some form of bondage, where, you know, say it's like addiction to entertainment, addiction to fear of others, fear of engaging, fear. So it's almost like the parable of the sower. It makes me think of it like, if we're not receiving the good seed from above, then, and I'm speaking like symbolically at this point, if we don't receive the seed from above, then that leaves us, that leaves a void that could be filled by other seed that could bring about harmful or negative patterns. So I just look at this too, and it's like, if we don't engage with marriage and the union properly, we lose out on this awesome opportunity to participate in the power of creation.
And I think we see it in the fact that all of these higher level patterns that we've been speaking about, the fact that they're not obvious to people is like a sign that other seeds have been planted, I believe. Because when, let's say, after writing this down, like it seems like the kind of stuff that should be much more obvious. Like people should know this. Like it should be readily available that, of course, there are things more important than your immediate pleasure, and you're going to undergo really powerful and beneficial transformations if you don't stop some of the purposes that are intrinsic in nature. But it's like not even on the radar for most people, because other seeds have taken the place.
Right. Well, JP, I feel like it's time to bring up aliens.
Yeah,
think?
At the end, we keep it for the end. Yeah,
I know. I've been like teasing it this whole time. So, so specifically, well, I want to draw upon the movie Arrival, because I have a lot of outlines and thesis for maybe, I think, about 5 or 6 essays at this point, all in the works. And the movie has obviously profoundly impacted me. We had this awesome discussion about aliens privately in our artist group. And then I said, "Oh, but JP, what about Arrival?" And you said, "Oh, I haven't watched it." And so I was like, "Okay, before we talk, you have to go watch Arrival." So did you watch Arrival?
Yeah. I mean, I had watched it, but a long time ago. So I rewatched it, and I had time to watch it over the last weekend.
Okay. So one of the things that I found interesting about the film is that well, folks, I don't want to spoil it, but I have to talk about the ending. So
yeah,
here it is. So I think the first thing to talk about is that the main character, Luis, is, it's at first you think, oh, well, she's the Mary figure, or she's Eve, right? And then so then Ian would be like Adam, and it's a creation story, right? Where you have the celestial beings coming from above, right? Or the heaven. And then you have it coming down to the cosmic mountain. And then you have the humanity coming up from the earth up the cosmic mountain to meet the great other, you could say.
Yep.
We see this in many other stories, most obviously in the Exodus story, Mount Sinai and Moses. So there's that happening. But then there's this interesting thing that happens with Luis as a mother. And so what she does is she receives the language, the grammar, we could call it the word, from the alien race that came. Turns out they're benevolent, which is nice. It's not like Independence Day alien movie. So in this alien invasion movie, they're benevolent. They want to bestow their transcendent mode of being through language. And Luis is going to be like Moses, who receives these patterns. And of course, in the movie, it's awesome. They come in like these logographic symbols. And so she receives this as if she's receiving the 10 Commandments. And then she comes down the mountain and she disseminates the pattern of their language, but also the pattern of their mode of being, but also their telos, the purpose of why it gives humanity a new purpose that can unify the entire human race. Just like
just to be sure, because I'm not, oh, sorry, I hit my mic, but I'm not sure what the purpose was exactly. Like, maybe you can remind me, because I recall that the aliens mentioned, like, through that message, that they would come back later, and like they would need humanity at that point. So is that what you mean by the telos?
Yeah. So a recurring theme, like she writes it on the board, is what is your purpose here? That's with alien invasion movies. That's always the question. You know, who are you? Who's your leader? What is your purpose here? They want to find if it's, you know, benevolent or malevolent. And of course, like, it's just interesting that the first level of communicate, or the first point of contact, is communication. It's funny. I'll be posting, before I post this, I'll be posting a conversation I had with Drew, an ethnomusicologist, and we have this cool back and forth of, you know, like Steven Spielberg's alien movie Encounters, where like they play synthesizers and music, and like, so it's like, is it that we play music? Is that the first point of connection? Or is it going to be language? And so Arrival makes the case for language. And the purpose, I guess the movie introduces that humanity is not unified. They're not speaking the same language. They don't have a unified telos, or a grand narrative or purpose that keeps us all together. As soon as some, you know, transcendent other arrives, we freak out and everybody scatters and it's chaos. And so the gift that the aliens give, the heptapods, is the gift of their language, which of course is a very religious narrative pattern, which we see in the Judeo-Christian narrative, right? With especially the whole thing's about the Garden of Eden and learning the divine language that God spoke. So the point here is that it's through receiving and integrating this language that gives humanity a purpose. So now all of humanity is going to unify in this this endeavor to learn this language. And the reason being is because, just like the aliens arrived the first time, they're going to have a second arrival, or a second advent, if you want to call it that. And so whenever they arrive the second time, humanity, because they embarked on this collective effort to learn this language, and therefore be able to perceive time in a different manner, in a higher, more transcendent manner, that they'll be able to say, like, weather whatever that storm is. How are we doing so far?
I think that's good. That's a really good summary. It shows that you've thought a lot about this this
Uh-huh.
movie. Um, okay, so and you wanted to tie it up with maybe one thing we could mention is aliens are often a good symbol for technology. And it's why we talked about them in a private conversation recently, because I've been trying to think about technology, and like, aliens can be a good symbol for technology because they're often technological, or like they come from the outside of let's say material existence, and they have a certain will of their own. So you can think of technology as having its own agency and like turning into full-blown beings. And then the idea of an alien invasion is this technology like being its own person and interacting with us, like whether positively or negatively. People have different intuitions about this. So like it's the typical trope of, let's say, technology waking up and interacting with us. So it's interesting that you tie it up so much with Genesis, let's say with Moses, or like with the Bible in general, because often like the garments of skin, the technology is viewed as something more negative. Not always, but often like it's not. Let's say when Moses ascends, he has to sort of let go of the garments of skin. But I mean, it's interesting that when he speaks with God, God gives him the plans of the tabernacle, which are
Mhm.
garments of skins. So there's that. There's probably something interesting also you can take with the cross, because the cross is also, it's also really related to technology, because I mean, Christ was a carpenter, and there's something also with the cross that he sort of built a cross, and you can link the cross and the ark as well, which was also like built. It's the ark is a garment of skin, and so
Mhm.
the cross is a garment of skin as well. It's also the ark with like the apostles that will recreate the world, but like the fact that it was done by Rome as well, like the crucifixion was carried out by Rome. Um, and Rome is like this empire, this like ultimate garment of skin, this system of garments of skin, like this technical beast. And like even the fact that Christ was nailed to the cross, like it's very like pointy tool garment kind of thing. There's
Mhm.
also the fact that he had the crown of thorns, which is also related to the garments. So there's all of those images that come together in the cross too of technology. But here in the case of Christ, it's interesting because it wasn't Christ who like actively perform these technological actions themselves. He more like used Rome's technology against it. So maybe you can see Rome as the alien there, but like
Oh,
Christ sort of
yeah,
turned
right.
it against. I mean, it's not that he turned it against something. It's more that Christ used the alien to flip the alien into the pattern to conquer Rome ultimately. So like this technical empire became Christian a few
Mhm.
centuries later. So it was incorporated into Christ. Um, but yeah, I'd be curious to know like how you,
Well, I could look at it this way, that Christ was the alien and we killed him.
because it was too, yeah,
Because like
because
in a way, he's well, it's interesting because it's like the incarnated logos. So it's like he's, you know, son of God, son of man. But
Mhm,
like he was the other, and he was
mhm,
killed outside of the city, on a tree or on a cross. So you could look at it that way. But then tying it to Arrival, that's pretty
mhm,
much the response that they did, because they ended up killing one of the aliens in a very Christ-like manner, where the alien sacrificed himself in order to preserve the word that was just delivered. It was like
mhm,
the whole pattern of the Ten Commandments and the tabernacle was given to Luis, right? They get like 1,000 of those little logo graphic images,
mhm,
and it's like the blueprint for the tabernacle essentially.
mhm,
But
mhm,
then there was also that element of the golden calf bomb,
mhm.
that they try to lift up this idol, I guess you could say, and
Yeah.
it was improper worship, kind of like tying to Cain. and
Mhm, yeah.
and what happened was is that the alien sacrificed himself knowingly in order to ensure that Luis and Ian could receive the full package of their language.
Yeah. Okay, well then maybe there's something interesting, because I really do think we have to nail down this garment of skin thing, because like it wouldn't, let's say it wouldn't fit the pattern for, because at the same time as Christ was turning Rome, turning the alien into his own pattern, Christ was also an ascetic at this moment, because like he was naked on a tree, like he couldn't like do anything.
He
It was
was
the ultimate
stripped of his
submission.
garments.
Yeah, yeah. So, but maybe we can try to map this to our arrival as well, because, and you know the movie better than I do, but if I try to think back about how the heptapods are depicted there, they don't necessarily look technological. Like as sometimes in alien movies, see the ships are obviously like really technical things. Like they have, let's say, buttons, or like they'll make sounds or whatever. But wasn't the case really in Arrival.
Yeah.
It looked, I don't know if I would say organic, but it felt, maybe it was a bit pure.
Well, okay, so sorry.
Go ahead.
So I just wanted to cut in because I was also noting that too. I'm like, how come the spaceship looks like a rock? It looks like a lava rock. What's up with that? And it's so simple. And it's because I was reading in James Jordan Through New Eyes book, and he talks about the difference between artificial mountains or man-made mountains like a ziggurat or a pyramid, compared to the cosmic mountains, which are made of matter. They're dirt, they're rocks. And that's where God meets humans, which is interesting. And so, well, I mean, he makes other points, but that distinction stood out to me, and it made me then think about Arrival, where, like, for example, you have the scissor jack, or the aerial lifting device, right, where they go into, and it reaches its extension and it can't go any higher. It's almost like the limits of man-made technology can't take it to the highest part of the cosmic mountain. But if you look at the spaceship, it's more Mount Sinai than anything else. And so it's almost like they're laying out, like I said, the Exodus pattern more so than the classical technology trope of aliens that we see.
Yeah. Did you think about why the gravity seems to shift kind of sideways?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So you'll be pleased about this. I just updated some of those sections to explain that more clearly. It's because whenever Moses is ascending the cosmic mountain, he enters that layer of clouds, right? Or the ladder of heaven, it's a cloud at the top. You don't quite see the top, the last rungs. You look at the cosmic trees, there's a cloud canopy at the top, right? Okay, so in Arrival, once they get up to that certain section, the limits of Earth and man-made technology, there's that liminal cloud-like layer, the mystery that's veiled of where exactly heaven and earth, cosmologically speaking, touch. You know, it's kind of like, to bring in the mother trope of this film, it's like we don't really, like, it's veiled, like how would you say it, the point of conception. You know, even with all of our anatomical technology and science, like it's still a mystery of how life is conceived and how at that moment it multiplies and we turn into conscious beings. And it's veiled for 40 weeks in the womb of the mother before it's unveiled through birth. It's interesting that the amount of days, if I'm calculating it correctly in the movie, the amount of days that that their team has a series of assaults up the cosmic mountain is 40. And so it's interesting, like it ties into the wilderness, ties into this like hidden transformation or procreation part where she enters Louise, but then she, on the last assault, she descends the mountain as a transformed being.
Yeah. That's really
so
interesting.
The liminal place, like the way that the movie showed it, the examples were what, like they jumped from that platform onto the rock-like material of the spaceship, and it was like going from the vertical plane to the horizontal. Really cool camera angles, like kind of mind-blowing to from a viewer's standpoint. But then they say the words. They say two words. It's the one is holy, and the other one is the F word. And at first, I was so disappointed because my wife is really sensitive to potty mouth language. And so I was like, oh no, am I like not going to be able to watch the rest of this movie? But the deeper I thought about it, it's this, in that place, that liminal place, it's the confusion of opposites, where up is down, horizontal is vertical, or in this case, the highest sacred word of holy is then put up right next to each other with the most profane word of our English language. So it's kind of interesting how they did that.
Yeah.
And then finally, they have the scene where they're walking into the cavern, where the meeting place, and the shot is them like walking upside down, right? And so it's like, anyway, so all of that are just examples of this liminal place where heaven and earth meet.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's really good. That makes sense. Then what I wonder about at this point is how to tie it with conception and the incarnation. So, I mean, there's, because the aliens, like the heptapods, they're not men, like they can't be the incarnation. So I don't know if you wanted to tie it up with, let's say, the fact that Louise will take in that logo, sort of that language, that way of making
for
sense
intents
of the
and
world.
purposes, that package of logograms that they give right at the end, that's the word, that's the logos, that's the entirety of the structure of meaning, the ordering principle of their language. So they deliver, they bestow upon her through grace the fullness of the word through that process. It's like, but it's interesting because it happens on the 40th day. So here's how I tie it in.
Yeah.
Because on that 40th day, the word was delivered. That was the last assault. That's where it ends. And so at that point, this is where the story ceases to be Gnostic, because David Broder brought up this pushback that I thought was really good, where he said that, it's just all about knowledge, it's about learning this language. And so my pushback to that is that's why they also bring in this layer in a very sophisticated way, this trope of motherhood and conception. So it's not good enough that we talk about sex. It's not good enough that we talk about the heptapod language. It has to be made flesh. And so they exemplify this. They take it one degree further, because they show the scenes of her like making the word flesh, as in like teaching it to her specialist, and then it descends the mountain, and then it's the classroom, and then it's the book that everybody in the world will read, right? Which looks an awful lot like Language of Creation by Mathieu Marceau, by the way. I don't know if you saw that. So that's in one of my essays too.
Symbolism happens.
That's think about that. So that's not good. What I loved is that they incorporated this element of like Adam and Eve, of masculine, feminine, of religion and science, of the seed in the womb, where she realizes that in order to go from this first arrival and get to the second arrival, we have to procreate. It has to become flesh. It has to be incarnated. The language that she received, it has to proceed. And so that's exemplified with her daughter Hannah. And her daughter Hannah, in the very big, again, I love how the movie starts. I don't really believe in beginnings and endings anymore. And then they show the ending of the film, and nobody knows it because they don't have eyes to see it. It's like brilliant. So then there's like this element. So on the very, like, say the thesis package of this is conception. So the seed, or that principle of the word that she received from the heptapods, is sown just like Ian and Louise, the two main characters, they conceive so that they can have this generation.
Mm-hmm.
The thing about Hannah is that in the beginning of the film, they show that she dies as a young girl, maybe a teenager.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
The book that it's based upon, Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang, she's a little bit older, but I like how they made it even younger, because it enters this question of humanity's purpose. And something that we see in the meaning crisis with nihilistic memes that you see of like, due to overpopulation, how could anybody consciously bring someone into this horrid, wretched world of suffering and malevolence? Right? Jordan Peterson does a great job bringing this up.
Mm-hmm.
So under that, the pressure of that question, how do we respond responsibly and fully? How do we explain suffering? How do we explain that we should even perceive and bring someone into a dead and dying world, that seemingly? So the answer in Arrival is that now we have a unifying telos. Now we have a purpose that can unify all of humanity. And so very practically, if we don't have babies, if we don't conceive, right, if the womb does not receive the seed,
Mm-hmm.
then we won't ever get to that fulfilling purpose down the road.
Mm-hmm. I had questions around this too, because I don't quite understand the role that Anna's death and also Ian's leaving. I don't understand the role that those two things play, because it's a place where things, I don't know how you fit that into the narrative, because it doesn't quite fit with the incarnation, at least. I mean, at least not straightforwardly.
So
I don't
I
know.
I think instead of thinking of it more so at this point of like Mary and the incarnation of delivering the Savior that would be sacrificed and killed.
Mm-hmm.
So it's playing on maybe like parts of that, but because it's compacting so many different layers and angles of narrative,
Mm-hmm.
it's important to understand all of these parts to figure out why one doesn't end and where one begins. Like, for example, like, why is Moses a female, right? Is this just some postmodern thing? It's like, I thought about that a lot with the first essay, but then I realized, oh no, she's the archetypal mother, right? She is the womb that receives the seed. She's the humanity that receives the word of God from on high. And because of that, she is a symbol of the feminine in all of its fullness. She also demonstrates the power of the feminine, like, for example, like the head leader, right? Maybe like the archetypal masculine in all of its aggressive form in the leader of China. And so how does she turn him? With subtlety. It's like, how do you turn the most hard-headed man? By the neck. And that's how she does it. So she's the archetypal feminine. Ian is Adam. He's the archetypal man. And so there's times where he demonstrates this correctly or procreatively, where after she receives the word, right, then he uses, very masculine traits of, like, say, calculation and science and reason to then take that and explain, oh, do the math. It's 1 of 12. We have to work together. Right. He finds that because of his masculine reason, whereas she discovers it based on her reception of the word. But then within the same characters, it shows their limitations later on with Hannah. It shows maybe the shadow or where masculine and femininity can go wrong in their traits. So she makes a mistake where she doesn't keep the future veiled. She knows the results because she has the frame of time, the transcendent frame of time that she received from the heptapod language and learning it. She knows that Hannah's going to die. So instead of keeping that veiled, like a womb veils the baby inside, she blurts it out. She makes some mistakes. She tells Ian and a time when he's not ready to hear it. And then he responds in, say, like a negative masculine pattern, where he says he can't reason why she would trick him into procreating together and making this child if she knew that the child would suffer a disease and die young. And so it shows the limits of reason within Ian.
Yeah.
Am I convincing you at this point?
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
Where's
It
the
just,
holes?
yeah, I just keep having questions because what, but what does, you talked a bit earlier about the role that conception plays in bringing humanity forward to the 3,000 years that are required until the heptapods come back. But there seems to be, I think in the movie, maybe there are some hints that Anna could play a more important role. I don't know, because Louise has a few flashbacks of her daughter, and or flash forwards, I should say, that are important in her uncovering the language. But I'm not like, I think we need something. I think we need a convincing reason why this conception happened, and like, what's the fruitfulness of that conception, considering that Anna died when she was young? What's the
in that it makes a really pro-life argument that there's intrinsic value in every human life, and that it transcends the suffering that we endure.
I recall in the movie that especially the scenes that they played of, let's say, Anna playing with Louise, or also the time they spent as a family, was very touching and motivating.
I cry every time, like the happy scenes and the sad scenes of Hannah and the family, because it just touches on such a deep parental level.
Yeah, that's true. So maybe the fruitfulness there isn't so much located, let's say, in what happens in Anna's life per se. It's more about the demonstration of the goodness of life itself, and how that realization will bear fruit elsewhere, even in the people who watch the movie, for instance, but also in the people who would know of that story within that universe, let's say. So it's about making a point for the value of life in spite of the suffering.
Yeah, exactly. Because I mean, like, it's not meaningless to say, like, hey, it's a really bad time, like, say disease is breaking out, or like there's a tyrannical government that wants to, do all of these wretched things to its citizenry. Like, maybe we shouldn't have kids. So I really liked how they did this turn instead of like Hannah being the next savior, because gosh, like we have enough movies that do that. So like I felt like they were like narratively brave in how they wove this pretty sophisticatedly into the other narratives, where so you have that narrative and it's like there is a level where it's meaningful and convincing. So the best story wins, right? As I think the Black Swan said it in that book. Where you have to come up with a better narrative. And I think this movie does it, where Luis is willing to make the sacrifice and endure the fullness of life, and I just love how they show scenes where it's like the most gleeful childlike moment where she's like trotting around pretending to ride a horse, and like the mom's tickling. It's like, oh my gosh, that's like the highlight of my day every day. He's playing these, like, all my kids like jump on me and I pretend to be a horse, and then I tickle them. It's like, it doesn't get better. But then it also shows the scene where she's dying of like cancer or something, and she's a teenager that's bald, and it's like about as low as it gets. But it shows that Louise is willing to be the example, because keep in mind she's the new cosmic Moses, or
she's the archetypal mother in this case.
And that's why I'm so profoundly perplexed by this film, is because she's the new Moses, and they do such a freaking good job of convincing that. And she's the archetypal mother. She's Eve. She's femininity in all of its forms, good and bad, dark and light. But she's the leader how do you say it? She's like Moses in that she's the leader of the people, but she's also the archetypal good mother in that she's willing to make the sacrifice and endure all of that because she has to set the example. So that's not going to be the result for everybody. Right. But she takes, like, say the worst case scenario, and she has like this cross, and she bears it.
Yeah, that's a great point. She has to make good out of the worst scenario.
Because the whole point, humanity's new purpose, is to make it to the second arrival. Which I don't know if you're picking up on this. I haven't spilled the beans yet, but like, they're laying out a Christian eschatology.
Before we get to that, I just want to make one point.
You don't have to address that. I just wanted to.
No, but I'm definitely curious. I definitely want to know. But what you said there made a lot of sense about like why the situation with the family of Louise, Ian, and Anna at the end, because I think that Ian leaving also fits that. Okay, so like you have the archetypal mother who like loses her child and is abandoned by the archetypal man, but she still gives the sacrifice to show the good out of it, and it's what carries through it. It's why she understood the language and why she could save humanity, like why she could prevent humanity from destroying itself, and it's how she gave it a purpose. And like this fact of Ian quitting in the face of suffering is also, I think, a good criticism of our age, where like where men aren't taking the place that they're supposed to take. We talked about contraception earlier. It's like we're not willing to accept the risks of full-blown participation, so people can just check out. So I think it all makes sense now. But anything else to add on that before?
Yeah, no,
because I'm
think,
curious about this eschatology now as well.
We finally have, how do you say it, matrimonially unified the two topics at hand, right? Where now people can understand, where it's like, oh, that's why they wanted to talk about contraception and aliens at the same conversation. Because like, I would say, like, the climax of your article is the ultimate purpose of sexuality is not pleasure, nor union, nor even procreation, but active participation in God's creation and redemption of the world. That's what their act was. That's the whole thing, and all of the different layers that we talked about. The Moses, it's an Exodus story, it's a creation story, it's Adam and Eve, it's masculinity, femininity, it's religion and science. It's this participation in God's creative act, and then also the redemption of the world, because she held, or she, how would you say it, humanity's new purpose, like a seed received from on high, was sown or conceived into Louise, but it has to come full term, and it has to be birthed. It has to be delivered into the rest of humanity. And then in that process, in order to fulfill their new purpose, they have to make babies and have generations to make it, 3,000 years down the road. So they can finally build this grand, like, meta narrative of humanity.
There's lots of links that we can see. Like, two things popped in mind. So one was the fact that to receive that language, Louise was the first one to remove the garments.
Yes,
she took them out. She took the contraceptives out, like of the suits and like the plastic, literally. Like she took
they're orange condoms is what they are.
Yeah, huge orange condoms. And like she even went beyond the window at some point. There's a point in the story, if I recall correctly, where she's not prevented by some glass, like blocking.
Oh yes, there's no veils.
No veils, like no
garments
condoms,
of skin,
like she's directly there.
Yes,
exactly. She's the one doing
in
that.
the top of the mountain, in the Holy of Holies,
Yeah, and it's also really important, I think, to underline the fact that the language that she learns there is an access to the logos, like that is outside of time. It's why they like this language gives, like, it connects the future and the past. And I think this, let's say, spiritual connection across time, like this capacity to rise outside of time, is tied up with conception in time. Like, it's what allows humanity to exist across time, like this connecting of the eternal and the temporal happens through procreation in this case. So like this new language, the fact that you have to learn this new language, like I'll have to think more about this part of it, but I think this connection, I think there's something there about like how the pattern that is at the spiritual level outside of time gets connected across time through procreation in the material world as well. But maybe it'll even help if you mention to me like what you had in mind about the Christian eschatology, had the coming back.
Well, like, I mean, there's a first advent of Christ, right? Where you could say like it was Christ the word was delivered to the cosmic mountain, and then in the upper room, it was disseminated, or it emanated throughout the disciples and then the rest of the world. So that similar spread has taken thousands of years, but it's global. It's everywhere, right? And so people are embodying and procreating and living out the pattern that they received at Pentecost. But it's almost like that was like, how does someone say it? It wasn't like the war was ended, right? That was like D-Day. D-Day didn't mean the end of World War II, but it was just like this definitive mark that carried out across time in the fullness of that story. So similarly, Christ's first advent was like that. It was like this triumphant victory that started a chain of events in time and history that is leading to his second coming, or second arrival, second advent. And so Christians have this teleology, this like, how'd you say it? It's we have a window into the future. And that's one thing that I really like about Louise, is that she's the first one. She has the fullness of this language that allows you to transcend how we understand time. And she knows the end from the beginning. And yet the book does a really great job explaining this in more of like a philosophical way. I highly recommend it. But it brings in this subject of teleology, which is another reason why I want to talk to you about this and keep this conversation going, is because you've had excellent articles and discussions lately on that. And it's a topic I need to understand, where like it allows us, kind of like how Paul said, we can see into the mirror dimly. That's where we're at right now, between the first and second arrival. And then we'll see things clearly. That's what he says it in 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter. So it's after the second arrival that we'll see things clearly. That story is consistent both in Christianity and arrival. And so what I love about Louise is that, so she has the clearest perspective and view of the future, right? And so she knows that her daughter's going to die. She knows how things are going to turn out. And yet she still decides to participate in the day-to-day activities. Like, I love how nuanced, like they show picking up rocks and like putting your finger into like little crevices. And, you know, it's like they show like the most fine-tuned particulars of life. But what's really interesting is that motherhood in general is like that, maybe at a foggier, dimmer level, where like you said, like narratively, like we're creatures that know the future dimly, but we do. We know that if we engage in sexual activity, high likelihood that we will procreate and make babies, and they're going to look kind of like us, maybe a lot like us. We know that the world is suffering now, so it probably will be later. You know, we know that life is hard now, and we've learned a lot of lessons to fortify ourselves and to grow and get better and to make a better world during our lifetime. We know that there's going to be generations and many generations. We know all of these things. Louise just knows it at a clearer perspective. So that's why I really find an encouragement in how she properly burdens the role of motherhood at its greatest extent that we could imagine, where you know the finest details of how it's going to turn out. We just know maybe like statistics, like it's this percentage of likeliness that your child is going to die before they become an adult. So in that sense, I really like how your article talks about the narrative sense, where like it's important to talk about the future or to have that telos as part of the day-to-day activities of your marriage, because that is what brings meaning to even the finest particularities of all of your life.
Yeah, they're all, yeah, it's connected. It's funny because earlier today I was reading a book by D.C. Schindler on Hans Urs von Balthasar. He's a Catholic theologian who describes truth as a drama. And it ties up with the emergence animation thing that we've been talking about in this corner of the internet, because in a in a story, in a good story, like a properly constructed story, you're surprised at the end. There's a kind of emergence of something new that you hadn't realized before. But once you know that, then you can also see it like in seed form at the beginning, and you see that it was always leading up there. So there's also a kind of emanation from this telos down to the particulars that allowed the emergence of that telos. So there's this simultaneous interpenetration of like the end, the telos, and the beginning, like the, let's say, material or efficient causes, and they're interconnected across time. So like we, as you said, we live dimly, like we have a dim perception of this typically, but some people can have a better perception of it. Often things become clear like later. There seem to be people who have, let's say, reached enough into those patterns that, let's say, they see more of the end in the
So
beginning.
you're kind of getting into like the role of prophecy, where like revelation, where something comes from on high and you get a vision of something or a message, like you receive something. But then there's like this other element where you just get so hyper perceptive.
Yeah,
you can see a series of events culminating, and you can predict the trajectory of that, how it will
yeah,
unfold.
yeah. And it's funny because I'm reminded of another example that Schindler uses. It's not in Balthasar, but he has also written about Plato in a book that John Vervaeke recommended in the last conversation I had with him and Paul Clay, which mentioned teleology, actually, which was largely about teleology. And it's the book really sheds a lot of light on Plato and Socrates, because Socrates seemed to know what was going to happen with him. If you look in the Republic, it actually starts by saying, "I descend." Like, and then there's this setup around the dialogue where they're sort of going down literally into like a certain part of the city, and of course in the middle of the Republic there's the cave analogy where Plato explains that, well, if you ascend the forms, if you ascend the layers of being, and you ultimately reach the good, which would be like receiving the plans of the tabernacle, receiving the language in arrival. Once you reach that, you're at a level of existence where you're communing with, let's say, the deepest layers of reality, but you can't stay there. Like, and it's funny because in the Republic, there's not that much of an argument. It's more like Socrates saying you need to come down from that layer. Like, we will force the philosophers, once they've ascended there, to come back down. And Plato also explains that once you do that, though, the philosopher will be killed. Like, he will be killed because he's coming down with the law, is coming down with the forms, is coming down with the knowledge of the good in a world that is like messed up in many ways. So people will want to kill him. And like the way that this sort of transcends, let's say, the book is when you realize that it's exactly what Socrates was doing. Like, Socrates ascended those layers, he received the law, you can say. He received like he communed with the good, and it gave him access to the forms, but he couldn't stay there. He had to go down in the cave to try to enlighten the others, and he knew that people would kill him. That's why the dialogue begins with, "I descend, I went down." Like, he knew that in, let's say, going into the city, he would eventually be killed. Like, he knew this pattern. He knew that like the end, he would he would face. So he had this good perception of the patterns, like this ability to access a language that is somehow outside of space and time. But like it was, and like it's tied up with this idea of incarnation as well. Like you have this language that gives you access to the terrible things that are going to happen. So you're able to connect like the present moment with the future moment, but they're bound up in sort of all of these interlocking forms, all of these interlocking patterns, this language that ties up the future and the past. So it seems to be that, like, let's see what Louis is doing and what Socrates are doing is, because they live at this level, let's say, because they've communed with at this level of reality, they're able to come down and do things that seem absurd to people, like how Ian felt about Louise, and also how you can see people felt about Socrates in general and wanted to kill him. There's this ability to, let's say, perceive. If you perceive the patterns well enough, it gives you sort of access to the past and the future in a way that won't destroy the world, but will, I don't know, make the world destroy you. I'm not sure.
You won't destroy the present as well.
Yeah.
That's yeah. Okay. So there is, if you recall, the point where after the Holies of Holies and she descends and she's trying to talk to, or near the end of the film, whenever she descends and she's really close, or she already has like the fullness, she can speak the language. It's interesting because the first people she talks to, say the specialist, the people just below her on the hierarchy of the mountain, is Colonel Weber, right? And so he's a masculine figure. He's a man of war. He's, very assertive. And she tells him the truth. And he has no grid for perceiving it. And he basically like treats her like she's crazy. And it's like, yeah, okay, we're closing up camp. We're leaving. And so then she goes to Ian and he like barely, he's not repulsed, but he's like unsure. And then he's the first one to be convinced. And then they actually do try to kill her because she takes the satellite phone and she has that conversation where she turns the neck of the Chinese general Chang, and they point all their guns at her, and they're right at the moment where they're going to kill her. So I don't know. I didn't even come close to thinking about that or tying it to Plato,
and she knew what was going to happen because she had talked with the Chinese leader in the future, but like this fact didn't prevent her from living the right thing in the present. Because I think when I try to consider this, like I cannot, like this kind of, I wonder like what kind of knowledge of the future I would need to have for it not to be self-destructive. Because if I had a certain, I can imagine all kinds of things that if I knew would happen in the future, I would do things differently now so that those things wouldn't happen in the future. But like what kind of knowledge of the patterns of reality would you need to have so that you actually reach like those points, so that you don't mess up the future by changing the present? I don't know.
That's the thing where, okay, so when we were talking about stories last time, or our first conversation, I had brought up a point that wasn't in the article, but worth bringing up here too, where think about Shakespeare, how he says, all of life is a stage. Characters have their entrances and their exits. It ties to how truth is a drama. And actually, if you look at it, gosh, I hadn't even thought about this, but like the window that the heptapods have, where they kind of like veil the fullness of their being because you only see like their waist. It looks like a stage. Like you could practically draw a curtain across it, and it's like this limited attention of focus. But then the other thing that's interesting is that Luis, and again, I think the book has more time just in the narrative, how you could lay out an idea in a book as opposed to a movie, where Louise decides to play her role rather than try to be an agent of change, or she tries to be a participant in history rather than a manipulator of it. So she can see things, and it's even then she doesn't say that she has like full what do they call that, where you can just, you have full clarity,
Mhm,
clairvoyant.
mhm,
It's still a little bit dim, where it's almost like instinctual, or it's not like she sees everything all the time. She's like, it's almost like she just knows the right thing to do in the right moment at the
mhm,
right time,
mhm.
and it comes to her, and she decides to participate and play her part in life stage.
Hmm. Yeah, you make me really interested. I think I'm gonna listen to the book now. But I
Oh,
think it
it's a
also.
short story, so
Oh, okay, okay.
by the time you put your 3x filter on it, man, you'll probably be able to listen to it in 10 minutes, maybe less.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'll listen to it for sure. But yeah, and I think I'll keep exploring Van Balthazar, and I think you may be interested in
Yeah, I
him as
took a note
well,
on that one.
because like he even describes reality as a theodrama. And I don't know much about him yet. That's why I'm just starting to study him. But like maybe I can tie it into Arrival, because I think his idea is, well, you can try to make your life centered around you, a sort of ego drama, but like there can be bad consequences to this. Ultimately, what you should do is make your life part of the theodrama, so the drama of God, of the logos. So say in Arrival, maybe you could say that ultimately Louise realizes that her life isn't about herself or about her plans, it's about the unfolding of the logos of that language. Like
Mhm.
she just participates in that drama that isn't centered about herself, but is centered around this logos.
Yeah, and of course that's a very Christian purpose or mission,
Mm,
that all of the members of that body will participate in. But that's what I'm talking about, JP, is like the more I get into this stuff, the more it's like, oh my gosh, my life is going to be so much greater and more full of purpose and
mhm,
action, and like all of even the seemingly most insignificant subtleties suddenly are all tied together
mhm,
in a narrative that I could never have conceived of by myself.
mhm. Yeah.
Ah, conceived. There it is again. All right,
Uh,
man. How you doing? I
yeah.
feel like we're at a pretty good stopping point. I
Yeah,
do
yeah,
want to
yeah.
leave it open just in case you had some, like, completely zealous thoughts that you just had to birth.
No, no, that's good. I'm good. It's really late for me too, but
I
I
know.
was I was too curious, so I just wanted to keep going. I never do this typically. Like I it's way past my bedtime here in Quebec, but yeah, this was too interesting, and also seeing the way that you are pulled into that story. It's really good for me to notice, because I tend to think much more about the metaphysical side of things, and also it's funny when you mentioned like how, because sometimes I get that too, where as a Christian I can see in like how great of a story we live, but then especially here in a highly secular place, I see the complete lack of story elsewhere. So it feels strange when I
Mm.
like how, let's say, flat the world around me is, and then going to church and diving into this super deep story. It's it's strange, and like speaking to you about this like only emphasizes this dichotomy. um yeah.
Yeah, I think that it's in being so impacted, but then dedicating so much time in studying the story of Arrival.
Mhm,
It's almost like this foreign or new story has helped unveil my ability to perceive Christianity
mhm,
as it can be lived.
mhm,
So it's like, I do my fair amount of Bible reading.
mhm,
And obviously, I can see a lot of the tropes and central themes and different motifs of the Bible
mhm,
in this film. But it's like this complementary story that
mhm,
helps me more clearly see the Christian life that I engage in.
mhm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think I have the same with Plato, and like through John Vervaeke, like it's this different thing that is outside of Christianity, but that still has a powerful metaphysic side of it, that if I understand it, then I can better understand Christianity too, and then vice versa. If I better understand Christianity, then I can sort of also go into Plato and understand more of it. So yeah, it's just surprising because I had never heard of somebody for whom Arrival has had such an impact. So
Well, I mean,
yeah.
there's other people too. Like if you look at the other video essays, most of them are centered around the time element.
Yeah.
But obviously, like I think in my list of, let's say, like the most essential pillars of narrative themes, it's probably like 8 or 9. Like we didn't get to talking about teleology until much later into the conversation. And so I'm grateful that I can share this, come down from the mountain and share it with all of the other YouTube and Symbolic World readers and viewers. But like I think about your work with John Vervaeke and the articles that you write, and I don't think I'd be able to see Arrival in the same way without them. Like especially your article on perception, and David Broder's too. Whereas like that seemed to unlock a series of events that then unlocked other ways of seeing the movie. So that for that, I'm very grateful. Appreciate that.
Yeah, and vice versa too. Like I also am very influenced by the work that we do on the Symbolic World blog, because this article that you wrote on the symbolism of story, for example, has really stuck with me, and like it influenced, in particular, some articles I wrote about the different layers of being and how they fit together, and also when the one you did on the burning bush, it also helped when thinking about Platonism and how God can manifest himself through creation without breaking creation. So, and other conversations I've had with people. So at some point I worked with Timothy on an article he did on art and how at some point he mentioned how the incarnation allows for the representation of God. And like we had to discuss quite a bunch about the incarnation so that we would put things in a way that would be okay and wouldn't like cross any heretical lines. And like thinking about this allowed me to, like, it really helped me write later about the incarnation itself. Like there's this like interesting confluence of things happening in this blog where like people's work influence one another, and
because like
interesting language.
I think that the incarnation, the unfolding how perception even works, I think those type of things, like I need to lean on those pretty heavily, or like how the word becomes flesh. So like like the articles on the blog are kind of like go-to material, just so I can personally perceive or understand, the topics like Arrival that just grip me.
Well,
so JP, I don't know how to arrive at an ending here, so
I think I should really go, but I'll be really looking forward to all of the articles you have planned for Arrival.
There we go.
It's a real deep movie, and I know that, I mean, I read like one essay that you have planned, so and it was good. You made a lot of good salient points, lots of stuff that we don't have time to mention like in a discussion, because I mean you do have, I think, like 7 planned, something like this.
I think I have a solid 6 right now for sure that are like developed outlines with way too many notes, embarrassing amount of notes.
It's gonna be real cool.
So I'm committed to the series. The first one will be the symbolism of ascending the sacred mountain, and we've already begun the back and forths of editing and redrafting. So that'll be the first one, and then language and masculine and feminine and creation story and teleology, and actually theology of the heptapods is on that list too. But okay, man. Awesome. Well, how about we end the recording, and we'll keep in touch. Look forward to what's coming up.
Great.